This video lecture will take a look at slavery in Africa. To begin, let's examine an image from the past. Examine the illustration. What is it showing? How cramped, unsanitary, and scary would it be for people in this situation? This image depicts a slave ship that commonly traveled along what was known as the Middle Passage. What we're seeing here are cross sections and overviews of the slave ship. And this particular type of slave ship relied on what was known as tight packing for the voyage. Basically, slave traders had one of two options. They could either choose to spread the slaves out on board to allow them more room, more breathing air, and more sanitary conditions, and therefore try to limit the amount of deaths from disease and exposure to heat, to cramped quarters, to provide them with more food and healthier conditions overall. The other option was tight packing. And this is where you basically just accepted that you were going to lose a large segment of the humans that were basically your cargo on this voyage, in hopes that you would basically maximize your profit once you arrived in the Caribbean. The Caribbean being the primary stop for most slave ships. So on board, the conditions were pretty grim indeed. As you can see from some of these illustrations here in this cross section, human beings really did not have much room at all. Basically, there was very little room between you, where you were laying, and the bunks, above you. As you can see from these these overviews right here, the space usually in between themselves, the slaves, was very limited, if non-existent. The idea being to basically cram as many human souls in the hold of this ship as possible. And then, excuse me, and then to try to limit the amount of deaths, one of the things that the slave traders did is they would bring them up on deck and then force them to dance, force them to exercise. They would feed them a really bare, nutritional, diet of gruel, and then they would be sent back below where they were left in chains. So overall, the the living witnesses that we have, the records that we have, depict this voyage as incredibly scary. Many Africans didn't know where they were going. They didn't know if they would ever see their homeland again. They were basically being forced aboard by other tribes that had been warring against them, that were not of their own, culture, their own background, their own group, and then being sold by even more foreign individuals, Europeans, who were armed with weapons, yelling at them, using whips and other means to force them on board. So some Africans, if when given the chance, actually would jump overboard even with their chains on. The idea being that they would rather risk drowning in the waters off the coast of Africa than to be forever parted with both their homeland as well as their families. So this is what we're examining today. We want to understand the origins of African slavery, examine the new global economy driving this industry, and then analyze the impact on African slaves and lives. So African slavery emerged in a very unique time in world history. For much of human history, especially known human history, the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere had been isolated from one another following the last Wisconsin ice glacial episode. So there was very little travel back and forth. You had some native populations native to the northern hemisphere, such as the Inuit, that did have a history of being able to travel, for example, between the 12 miles that separated what is known today as Siberia with modern Alaska, and establishing cultural zones in both hemispheres. Another group of intrepid Vikings departed from Scandinavia, first arriving in Iceland, then bouncing over to Greenland, before arriving for a very brief time in Newfoundland, where they established colonies, but eventually these colonies were defeated, and the survivors returned to Scandinavia after a series of conflicts with local Native Americans. So, with the voyage of Columbus to the Americas and the opening up of the Americas to European conquest through war, through disease, and through other means, Europeans had new lands that they were able to turn to agricultural production, and therefore increase the wealth, the power, and the livelihoods of their home kingdoms. Now, initially, the main source of labor for these colonies were what were known as indentured servitude or servants, and these were individuals that basically surrendered anywhere from 5 to 7 years of their lives for the price of a boat ride over to the New World, and then eventually their freedom and some land. Usually, these indentured servants were put to work either producing cash crops such as wheat that could be used in other colonies or sent back to Great Britain. Tobacco in the early 1600s became a major cash crop for much of the Western Hemisphere. But eventually, sugar became the main driver of colonization. Around the 1600s, the Dutch finally improved some of the technology needed to mass produce sugar cane, and it found a very ready market back in Europe. And so the West Indies, as they were known back then, what we call the Caribbean today, this was the primary spot for the production of sugar. There is a problem with sugar production, however. It is very difficult, very, you know, grueling, just simply taking care of the sugar cane and preparing the fields and preparing for the harvest. But when it actually comes time to harvest it, you're talking about a time period of about 48 hours to cut the cane, to crush the cane, to boil the cane, to produce the raw product that is later refined into the white sugary, or the white sugar that people are used to putting on breakfast cereals or in coffee or in tea. So usually the workforces that were doing this labor were working around the clock, very little rest, very little food, little time to kind of relax and just recharge their batteries. It was dangerous work. One of the things that the sugar plantations used in the process were these sugar crushers, which looked like these vertical drums, and they were attached to gears that were then pulled by animals. And so what you did is you fed the sugar cane here in between the crushers, and as you're feeding them, sometimes when you're tired and you're hungry and you're thirsty, your attention slips and your hand can get caught in between those crushers, and it's very easy to lose a limb or even your life. So it didn't take very long before indentured servants quickly realized that this was not worth the price for the boat ride over to the New World, especially when they could focus instead on, going to British North America, having labor that was a little less dangerous, a little less grueling, and stand a better chance of actually surviving and getting their land. So what did the Europeans do? Well, they turned to the continent of Africa. At the time of colonization, there was, as Europeans branched out, as they explored new areas, new cultures, new life ways, they began to develop this concept of race. And the concept was basically that they believed that there were fundamental differences between human beings, fundamental differences in intelligence, in physical capabilities, in other areas, based simply on physical appearance, skin color. And in addition, and so this is where basically this concept of race comes in. Now, in the early 1800s, when Charles Darwin was, going through and taking a look at human development, he actually came to the conclusion that physical appearances really had nothing to do whatsoever with intelligence, with capability, with size, with stamina, with human ability. In fact, he concluded that all human beings were descended from quote unquote the same arboreal species. That's the term he used. And by arboreal species, he was basically meaning primates. Today, genetics further proves that skin color is just simply chemicals in the body. That physical features have absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with one's abilities. So this idea of race as a determining factor in someone's capabilities is largely rejected in modern day society, but in this time period, people firmly believed in it. Now, in addition to that, Africa had been exposed to some of what were known as Abrahamic religions. So this is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In Ethiopia, there was the presence of some Christian communities, and throughout much of northern Africa and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, uh, Islam had long since penetrated into the region. So you had that one little pocket there of Christianity, and then Islam basically reached all of this area, some of these sub-Saharan kingdoms down here, and then along the eastern coast that had been involved in trade with Arab traders for a long time, Islam had penetrated as well. But what the Christians basically said is they argued that, while it was unjust to enslave another Christian, the same did not go for people of other religions. So the justification that they developed and that would continue on for slavery in the United States and especially into the 1860s was that slavery was justified because they were not enslaving Christians, and in addition to that, they believed that they had a right based on racial grounds. So what usually happened was that the Europeans would go into Africa and they would establish what were known as factories. And so in specific points along the African coast. And by factory, I don't mean a factory in the sense of something that produces finished goods. A factory was basically a slave trading post. And then what they would do is they would hire out for these coastal tribes to basically go on slave raids into the interior against other tribes. And what they usually would pay them with were some of the finished goods that Europeans had access to, goods that they were importing from Asia. But in addition to that, weaponry, this new technology that Europeans had access to. So for the captured African, the process, the nightmare, if you will, actually started here in the interior, where their village was attacked or where they were kidnapped or forced into slavery. And then you had what was actually the first passage. Here in the factory, they were then sorted out. They were basically auctioned off and traded to the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, whoever was buying them at the time. And then began the Middle Passage. And that was that trip aboard those ships that we saw earlier to usually the Caribbean. And the reason why they stopped at the Caribbean is in the Caribbean, there was a huge demand for slave labor, largely because of sugar production. And in the Caribbean, they had choices to make, these plantation owners. On the one hand, they could try to prolong the lives of their slaves, provide them with good nourishment, less demanding tasks during the harvest season, or they could work them as hard as they possibly could, risking an early death of one of the slaves, and churn out as much sugar as possible. And since the profits were so high, what they usually did is they opted for the latter. So right here, this is the key number. Statistical analyses of slave lifespans in the Caribbean show that 10 years once a slave arrived on a plantation in the Caribbean, that is how long they were expected to last. Oftentimes during the harvest season, they had limbs that were caught, they were overworked. It was just a very gruesome, very bad condition for them. Now, some slaves were then resold to British North America from these plantations as another source of revenue for these plantation owners. And then once here, they were usually put to work on rice plantations, tobacco plantations, in the very dangerous mines, silver and gold mines of New Spain. But this is where the population of African slaves within British North America and Spanish South and Central America emerged. Now, slavery throughout the Americas was treated differently depending on where you were. Some empires, such as France, actually recognized some rights among their slaves. So, in France, for example, it was recognized that slaves had the right to marry. You also had in some other empires like Spain uh, the ability of slaves to eventually be able to become what was called manumitted or freed. In the United States or in the British North American colonies, on the other hand, it was a very different story. Starting in Jamaica and Barbados, roughly, too far up. Jamaica and Barbados, roughly in these two areas, slave codes developed on the plantation system that basically treated African slaves as what was known as chattel property. And this is the term that they used throughout the 16, 17, into the 1800s. And so by chattel property, this basically stripped away the human rights of African slaves to the level of livestock. So when these slave codes were exported to the southern colonies of British North America, one of the characteristics of these laws that were passed was that you were not allowed to teach a slave how to read and write. Slaves were not allowed to leave plantations without passes. Masters were able to physically punish slaves, and they had all sorts of gruesome mechanisms to do this. So, for example, one type of contraption they had was a collar that had these long spike-like arms that extended up out of it, and then the slaves, went around the slave's neck, and this was considered one of the ways to keep them from running away. This very cumbersome object on their head. In some southern colonies, it was even permitted to cut off a limb, a foot. The idea being that slaves would not be able to run away with only one foot. In addition to that, the slave codes basically said that the condition of an African slave was dependent on the mother. And this was one of the key things of the slave codes. That basically meant that the moment a person of African ancestry was born to a slave mother, he or she was therefore considered legal property all the way from the cradle to the grave, unless somehow they managed to win their freedom, to escape and run away, or in the instances when slave owners did free them. And this would be the condition throughout much of the Western Hemisphere until finally, starting in the early 1800s, these empires and these newly born republics started to outlaw the slave trade. And it really started with Britain in 1833. And so once Britain outlawed the slave trade, and this was followed by, this also happened in the United States, 1808. So really it was about 1808 when Britain and the United States said, okay, no more interstate slave trade. And then what Britain did is in 1833 is they said, okay, we're abolishing slavery in the Caribbean. And once that happened, the slave trade reduced somewhat, although the some of the South and Central American countries um, did allow the continued importation of slaves for a little bit longer. And then generally throughout the Western Hemisphere, slave owners were more than willing to risk, breaking the law by engaging in the illegal slave trade. But this started to tamp down on it a bit, especially when Great Britain pulled the weight of its entire navy behind the anti-slavery clause, and their naval vessels began actually patrolling the waters along the African coast, and in some cases they would even attack and close down some of these factories that continue to operate. But slavery itself did not disappear, even though the slave trade did. So many of the Latin American countries, they began the process of abolishing slavery pretty early on in the early 1800s. There was the modern day nation of Haiti right here that witnessed the only successful slave rebellion that created a country run by former slaves. And this process was led by a guy named Toussaint Louverture. Following that, you had Latin American countries. This kind of started the process, but there were two major holdouts: what became the United States of America and what became Brazil. The United States of America did not finally abolish slavery until 1864 after a very bitter civil war, and Brazil took another 24 years following that. So throughout the Atlantic world, this began what's oftentimes been referred to as the African diaspora, the forced relocation of Africans from their homes. And so it did create African American communities, African communities that eventually were merged into Mexico and Brazil, even Great Britain and France. But the big question is, what happened back home? Well, keep in mind that when these countries were engaging in this African slave trade, one of the things that they were promoting in Africa was conflict. And anytime you have conflict, you have a disruption of society. So you basically have a population, it's balanced, it has the elderly that, for example, carry traditions. The middle age are the ones that produce all the goods. They're the ones developing the techniques. They know how to work with tools, coming up with new ideas. And then you have the youth that are learning from the elderly, and they're learning from the middle-aged adults. So the society works to keep this balance. You have traditional ways of living, traditional ways of doing things, of governing oneself. You have art, you have culture, you have religion, everything that a society entails. Well, war disrupts that, especially when populations start losing large numbers of people. And as this disruption happens, these political bonds, these economic systems, religions, social harmony, it is disrupted as well. It's interfered with. So this is one of the first big catastrophes that Africa faces, is the slave trade that basically sapped much of the continent of humans and forced them abroad. And then later this would be compounded in the 1800s when Africa was colonized by other powers. And then it wasn't just simply their people that had been taken from the continent, but to add to this, their resources would be shipped abroad for the use of the colonial powers that were in Africa. So this was a period starting, with the colonization of the Americas and continuing into the 1800s that really sent shockwaves after shockwaves throughout the continent. And today, Africa is still struggling with the legacy of this. They continue to try to rebuild societies and establish political harmony and create consensus within governments. They are engaging in economic programs trying to establish, strong, viable economies, to develop them beyond agriculture, to attract business and develop education systems. And they continue to look to the past for inspiration, and and we definitely see this, for example, in the arts, where some countries such as Nigeria today uh, produces kente cloth that was once the product of the Akan states, the Ashanti people, as a sign of not only beauty but also of national independence and the strength that they could draw from their ancestors.